People have been asking me to weigh in on this latest round of police violence, the execution, the protests, with a, quote, spiral dynamics perspective. And what they mean is they want me to color code the police, to color code the protesters, American society, policy in this country, racism, and what they're expecting is a giant color washed across it all with great big brush strokes that is going to confirm their views, that is going to confirm their inherent understandings. And they want confirmation, for example, that violence is red. It's not. Then, once they get that, we can all nod knowingly with the collective experience of superiority, the appropriate tisk-tisk, and then remain safely data distanced. My name's Natasha Todorovic Cowan, and I've delivered over 200 spiral dynamics certification trainings in over 15 different countries, over 20 years since I joined the National Value Center in 1998. And I have refused to contribute with those simplifications. Why? Well, I believe it encourages the very same mindset, the very practices, the easy judgments that contribute to the problems that we're seeing in our collective societies. Every week in this country, in the US, 2 to 3 Black people are killed at the hands of law enforcement. And this appalling statistic is made even more horrific by the lack of accountability and prosecutions in our institutions. And as some of you know, I've seen the effects of policy on the residents of Palm Island in Australia, also known as the most violent place in that country, where the Aboriginal people are treated like children by the authorities placed there to oversee them. I've been to the informal settlements of South Africa, stood with Chris in Nelson Mandela's home, been to the Hector Peterson Memorial. We've marched with reformers in the inner cities of the US and visited the favelas of Brazil and the informal settlements of South Africa. We drank with the residents in their shebeens, and we had glimpses of their lives as we talked about what was most challenging to them, what was difficult, how they found life in South Africa. I also had the privilege of hearing the stories of the Black Panthers in Oakland and having them share their stories and history with me. I spoke on the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training stage and conference. And when I shared stories of where our spiral dynamics programs were having an impact and being used in policing in other countries, and when I shared their successes of those who worked in other nations and how they'd made a difference with protesters, I wasn't invited back. And I wasn't invited back to share further ideas because I was accused of advocating approaches that led to officer endangerment. This happened because habit, policy, training, mindset, beliefs were so ingrained that no other options, even though they were successful elsewhere, were even acceptable to discuss. And despite having impacted policing in a city where the program caused a 90% drop in citizen complaints, our approach is too outside the norm until and only when everything else has failed. And that's usually when it's too late, when it is most visible and it is most intractable and most costly to fix. And everybody knows there's a problem, and nobody can deny it. So I can share with you what happened here. I can speak from a database perspective. I can speak from a psychologically informed perspective. I can speak from a sociologically informed perspective. I can speak from the data that we have gathered on racism, on authoritarianism, on prejudice from hundreds of people in close to 50 different countries on 5 continents. And I have taught the material that reveals to us our very nature and locations around the world. And the tragedy of this data, of the teaching, of the quote knowing, is that it doesn't matter how much information we have shared or have. It doesn't matter how much data we try to teach or what we think we know. It's only when we put the insights to use in purposefully changing our own behavior in small and big ways, and in calling for accountability in ourselves, in our friends, in those that we can write letters to, in protest, that the policies and practices and large-scale behavior in the people that speak on behalf of our institutions will change. It's in our day-to-day interactions, moment to moment. We need to be changing the way we approach others. And until we do that, things cannot and will not change. For 20 years, over 20 years, I have seen people in our own spiral dynamics community use what we have taught, our color code, our trade dress, our logo, to discriminate, to label, to pigeonhole, and to color unfairly those with whom they agree and disagree, those who they like and don't like. The spiral hasn't been used to inform, but to justify beliefs. Beliefs about others' inadequacy, beliefs about repellent behaviors, the judgments about those others deemed to be inferior, with a very facile labeling and without an attempt to look below the surface, to go deeper into the very thing that those colors were originally intended to convey. When Chris created those colors, he did not create them as a name-calling device. That's how people use them. They were meant to get curious about the analysis, about going deeper. And we as a community have failed to do that. We've watched people in our classes claiming to be egalitarians place upon the wall pictures, their views of others. And the way it tended to work was those of darker skin were on the spectrum of lower complexity, while the more fair-skinned people from the medium to the higher complexity. And they didn't even see their own biases and the implications of placing those pictures on the wall in that format. They were blind to their own blindness. This is within our own community. The biggest problem, 99% of those color labelings that people do with the colors are wrong. 99% of them. There is no common spiral dynamics language, but there is a very common misunderstanding of the material. And there's a common desire, and I would go so far as to say a common compulsion to label, and that is what needs to be scrutinized. So this experience over years has highlighted 2 things for me. One, how invisible humans are to one another and how easily we dismiss others. And 2, how categorization and quick gotcha games are rampant in our human psyche. Look, I get it. It's not popular or comfortable to acknowledge that this is endemic to our very nature. And therefore, it's endemic to our institutions that our nature has built and which we now decry. So unless Every single one of us commits to changing our own behavior, our own thinking, the way we're perceiving others, until we think about how we think, until we deeply consider how we interpret who others are, what we use to evaluate them, the conclusions we make because of those tools, and what we need to do to get to know them and the events that shape them. Well, this isn't going to change. So in the smallest of dismissals, we enact the very thing we decry. Yeah, you might be outraged, but until we do this individually, until we do this in this community, until we transform the training, the mindsets of those around us, those who are working the streets where our Black and brown brothers and sisters are living and struggling, this is going to continue because we have to rip it out of ourselves. That I live in a nation where this can happen is deplorable. That I live in a nation where this happens repeatedly is horrifyingly unacceptable. In the city in which I live, we have a mayor who at one point decried and castigated the very thing that she has now become. She decried racism and accused those in power of abuse. Now a Latina accused of being white by protesters. She stood with the police. She refused to take the knee and assert that Black lives matter. That's all they wanted her to do, is say Black lives matter. She couldn't do that. It was an embarrassing moment, and it was a clear lack of empathy. Yet this shows the power of the institution to create conforming behavior in the individual. It illustrates the power of culture to shape an individual. The policies that led to this, the norms that led up to this is where habits and views and beliefs and worldviews made manifest, made it possible that they continue to exist, is not something that we can easily shift and change. And we have to call out behavior at the individual level, in ourselves, in our friends, in those we know, at the community level, and also at the policy level. So you want to make a difference? Stop using the colors as your own personal proof of bias. Stop using the colors to look down on others. Stop using the colors as an opportunistic way to make yourself right and others wrong. Stop using the colors to pigeonhole and to mislead. The Spiral Dynamics logo is not your personal tool for retaliation, dismissal, and gotcha games. And as long as you play that way, the things that you find distasteful outside will be what you need to work on within you. What can you do? Begin getting a good, sound understanding of this approach with an authorized training. Learn what sound analysis looks like. Get curious about other human beings who look different, who think differently. Stop pathologizing them. Explore your own contributions, both effective and non-effective, and start looking at how you think. We can't think our way out or analyze our way out of racism. We need to relate our way out and build relationship systems and institutions that work for the people that they were meant to serve. And I can believe, and I truly do believe, that we can do that only with a sound understanding of the many models and topics and analyses that we cover in our Spiral Dynamics programs, and that we use our Spiral Dynamics tools to analyze. Just do it right. Just do it right.